Welcome to Presentation, Ponder, Practice. The writer of Hebrews continues his discussion from chapter 8 on the differences between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant, but with a focus in chapter 9 on the differences between the earthly sanctuary of the Old Covenant and the heavenly sanctuary of the New Covenant. The writer mentioned this contrast back in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 8. Let's pick up now in chapter 9, verse 1, as he continues this contrast, but with a statement of similarity to begin with. Now even the first had regulations of divine worship and the earthly sanctuary. The term covenant is implied concerning that which was first. Now even shows that both covenants have this in common: regulations of divine worship and the use of a sanctuary. Regulations translates a word for requirement or commandment. The first covenant had rules for divine worship, certain acts of service, just as the second covenant now has rules for divine worship. The earthly sanctuary used under the old covenant was on earth, and its nature was pertaining to the world. A sanctuary, literally holy, is a place for worship. This is not to be confused with the holy places in verse 2, which was the outer part of the sanctuary. The term itself, sanctuary, in verse 1 refers to the place as the whole place for worship. The term tent, translated tabernacle in chapter 8, verse 2, the holy place in chapter 9 verse 2, and the Holy of Holies or most holy place in chapter 9 verse 3 all refer to various portions of the same building or structure. For there was a tabernacle, sacred tent, prepared. The tent that was built consisted of the outer one, literally the first, in which were the lampstand and the table and the sacred bread, or loaves of presentation. This first area entered into is called the holy place. The place of worship housed the objects needed to meet the rules for divine worship under the Old Covenant: the lampstand and the table. The lampstand is described in Exodus chapter 25, verses 31 through 39. Also, Leviticus chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. The bread of the presence, multiple loaves, Exodus 24, verses 5 through 9, was on the table as described in Exodus 25, verses 23 through 30, and chapter 37, verses 10 through 16. Behind the second veil or curtain, there was a tabernacle, a sacred tent, which is called the Holy of Holies. Inside the Holy of Holies was a golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered from all directions with gold. Incense was burned on the altar twice a day, Exodus chapter 30, verses 1 through 10. Based on verse 6 of Exodus chapter 30 and Leviticus chapter 16, verse 12 and verse 18, the altar was kept in the outer part of the sanctuary, the holy place. The writer of Hebrews, therefore, is speaking more of the function and relation of these objects than the physical location of them. The Ark of the Covenant is described in Exodus chapter 25, verses 10 through 16. The objects in it, which are named in verse 4 of Hebrews chapter 9, were linked to the making of the covenant between God and Israel. In the ark, box, or chest was a golden jar holding the manna, Aaron's rod which budded, and the tables of the covenant. The jar could probably hold about 2 liters, Exodus chapter 16, verse 33. Aaron's staff or rod was used for walking, and it budded, and it even bore ripe almonds, Numbers chapter 17, verses 8 through 10. The tablets of the covenant refer to the stone tablets, which the commandments of God were written on, Exodus 25, verse 16, and Deuteronomy 10, verses 3 through 5. The phrase, the tables of the covenant, is found in the Septuagint translation of 1 Kings chapter 8, verse 9. The Septuagint being the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. A similar phrase is also read in Deuteronomy chapter 9, verse 9 and verse 11. But the Hebrew writer says, above, speaking of the Ark of the Covenant, were the cherubim of glory overshadowing the mercy seat. Cherubs were signs of God's glory or presence. Cherubim is a Greek term borrowed from Hebrew. Cherubs is the proper plural form for the winged creatures over the mercy seat. Exodus chapter 25, verses 17 through 22 describe them along with the place where sins were forgiven. Cherubs were overshadowing or casting a shadow upon the mercy seat. The mercy seat, which covered the Ark of the Covenant, was splashed with blood once a year on the Day of Atonement as a sign that Israel's sins were forgiven. The same word appears in Romans chapter 3 and verse 25 as propitiation, describing the act of Jesus forgiving men's sins. But of these, the Hebrew writer says, the things mentioned in verses 1 through 5a, we cannot now speak in detail. This was not the place for the writer to explain all of this in greater detail, so he turned his attention elsewhere. Here now verses 6 and 7, which describe what happened in the earthly sanctuary. When everything was prepared, the priest went into the first area, the holy place, Numbers chapter 18, verses 2 through 6, to perform the divine worship twice a day. Verse 7, but into the second, only the high priest enters once a year, not without blood, which he offers for himself and for the sins of the people committed in ignorance. Only one person served as high priest at a time. Once a year, the high priest went into the Holy of Holies, the second curtain of the tent. This occasion was on the Day of Atonement. On that day, offerings were made on the altar to obtain God's forgiveness for sins, Leviticus chapter 16. The sacrifice was offered in the outer part of the sanctuary. Then the blood was taken into the inner part by the priest. This offering was given for the sins of the high priest and the sins of the people, which were done in ignorance, a term meaning oversight or something left undone by mistake. The Old Covenant does not speak of forgiveness when sins were done knowingly or deliberately. The objects used in Old Testament worship and the duties of the priest and the high priest are shown to be important to God. The earthly sanctuary, the tabernacle, had many rules and regulations which were followed precisely for divine worship. Ponder these thoughts. Worship is by God's design. Worship brings sinful men before the holy God. Sin must be dealt with because it separates men from God. So sin must be dealt with before men approach God. We are never closer to God while on earth than when we worship God. Turn to God, seeking forgiveness for your sins. Worship God and Him only. May God bless you.